So for more on this now, I do want to bring in Verónica Gonzales-Zamora. She is a professor at the University of New Mexico School of Law and is in Albuquerque. Verónica, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Arthur.
So now, as we just heard from a reporter, the bill is not expected to pass. This doesn't come as a surprise.
That's right. Everybody kind of knew going into it that the Senate doesn't have enough votes, and they don't have enough votes to do a filibuster, and so we're sort of stuck really with the voting record, right? How did the senators vote? And hopefully, like your previous correspondent explained, hopefully that informs voters and they come out and they vote more Democrats into office, or at least keep the seats that are Democratic.
Now, as we do await that vote, what if, you know, Roe v. Wade was codified, which is what we're seeing a lot of the senators talk about? What would that mean? What would it settle, the issue of access in the U.S.?
You know, legislation is not necessarily going to settle any question. It might for the time being. But one of the issues that we have in the United States is that we have this sort of revolving door of senators. For example, we have 34 seats out of 100 that are up for election this November. And so any group of senators, any administration can come in and change their minds. They can repeal, amend, withdraw, broaden. They really have you know, everything on the table as far as options. But if the bill were to pass now, what it would do is basically codify what's already in Roe, which is basically allowing states to restrict, perhaps, or burden, in quotes, that's the language the court uses, would allow states to restrict abortion access without totally banning it. And so states can then decide how difficult do they want to make it for people to access abortion care or providers to provide abortion care or not. But under the legislation, providers would have the right to provide that care, and individuals would have the right to access that care. So it's also going slightly a step further than Roe in not allowing states to impose undue burdens and due burdens. So really, it's getting rid of all of those burdens that are currently in place under Roe. And for that reason, it's a little shaky. There's a lot of debate, and I think any legislation that's approved is always subject to further debate.
You know, you mentioned how this would put then onus on states, you know, in order to make a stance on where they are when it comes to access in this particular matter. We did hear from the senior Democratic senator there, from Chuck Schumer, saying that this is backsliding. What is the mood of the American public? Because we heard from Mitch McConnell that the Democratic bill doesn't seem to reflect how Americans are feeling about it. How do Americans feel about this issue?
You know, it's really difficult to say. Speaking from my own personal experience, and I've been following the news as well, and the scholarly work on this topic, I think folks are really all over the place. But one thing that's critical, I think, is that the folks who are talking about it and voting about it in the Congress, in the United States Senate, are not representative necessarily of the people who would be affected by this particular legislation. We know from data that primarily women who already have children, trans women, women of color, low-income women, those are all women who typically or are in the majority of people who access abortion care. And so that's not necessarily the population of people who are in Congress and Senate voting on this bill. And so there will be some disconnect. And I think it's important for legislators to listen to their constituents, to reach out to the constituents who are more likely to access this type of care. Otherwise, we're really just going to end up with, you know, the same thing that already happened with this bill, which is not going to go anywhere. And we'll have maybe some other version of it come out. And folks are still going to be really debating it publicly and within the Senate, but maybe in different ways.
Now, you know, in this part of the country, or, you know, we certainly, in Canada, it's widely known that issues that are big in the United States can bleed into our political discussions, et cetera. And so it is something that there was an announcement today by federal ministers when it came to funding for access to abortions. You were listening into that. I'm wondering if you're able at all to sort of contrast maybe the tone and the policies that you're seeing on both sides of the border.
Sure. I think in the United States, we still have a divide, and this is very clear in the draft opinion that was leaked. The court sort of surveys how many states want it to hold the ban unconstitutional, and how many believe that this is within state powers, and the court needs to overrule Roe v. Wade and Casey. In any event, we see a sharp divide in the public discourse and the scholarly discourse, and we see people all over the map, from no abortion access at all to allow states to put some burdens, but not totally ban the right to access that care, to people who say, look, it should just be unfettered access. And I think seeing those debates happen publicly, also in the media, you tend to see sort of the polarizing views of it. When I tuned in today on the live broadcast of the ministers talking about this new bill that will protect access to abortion care, I thought, wow, it's not charged language. The questions that the reporters were asking were very thoughtful, and people seemed very invested in protecting women's rights. It almost seemed as though there was some sort of consensus, and that's just my impression based on watching that short 10-minute briefing. But I think really the conversation is different. It almost seemed like a settled question, really. And the idea that your government is looking ahead and thinking about how do we protect these rights so that we don't have the same thing happen in our country. And I think really in the United States, we've been fighting for these rights for a long time, but it's always sort of short-sighted. It's always subject to more debates, and depending on who's in power at the time or which justices are on the bench at the time, it's always subject to being changed or overruled or withdrawn or amended, depending if it's the courts or Congress. And I think for that reason, the American people perhaps lots of women are asking themselves, right? Am I going to continue having this right? And that's a scary place to be.
Thank you so much for your time today to discuss this with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
That was Verónica Gonzales-Zamora. She is a professor at the University of New Mexico School of Law. She joined us from Albuquerque.